And hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture from Turku again. And now, after that very important lecture concerning just, the important steps necessary for the emergence of life, we are moving towards life as such. And we should be talking about possibly the very most simple living organisms, most simple life forms. But now this is certainly very difficult to do because as such the emergence of life has been a gradual process leading stepwise from the inorganic and organic and prebiotic chemistry towards life. And it is really very difficult to determine exactly where life would have started. And for one reason, this is because we cannot quite exactly even define what is life. So if we are looking at the very early versions or stages of life, it certainly has been different from what we now recognize as life. So most likely I cannot really catch the most simple life forms in this lecture, but let's try anyway. So one of the difficult questions is what is life? But let's start with the life as we know it now. So life looks something like this. It looks like very versatile process. It comes in all sizes and shapes and forms and colors and everything. And it really looks very, very versatile. And so it certainly is very different and distinct from inanimate or from the physical world. So we can easily recognize life for life. But even so, it is very, very difficult to define or to determine what is life. And one reason for this is a fact that now would appear behind my picture there in the corner, which is that on this planet we basically have only one kind of life. So even that the living creatures look so very different, then if we look at the chemical level, all life forms are pretty much similar to one another. So we have only one kind of life here. And as such, with the one example, it is very difficult to define what is life or what else could be life. But anyway, we know that life is very distinct and it is very different from inanimate world, and we can easily tell qualities of life. And we know, for instance, that life has a chemical composition that is very different from the physical world. So in the earlier lectures we have heard that life is composed of just basically of 6 different elements: the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, so the SNOPs chemicals. And we have also heard, for instance, from Hervé's lecture, that these elements are bound in very, very complex molecules. So it is a very complicated chemical world. And with this complex chemistry, it can maintain itself. So also functionally, it is very, very complicated. And because of these properties, it is very separate from physical world. For instance, here on the rock surface, we can say that the green stuff here is living. It's composed of these carbonaceous complex molecules, while the rock behind it is not living. And also we can say that the dead tree here is of biochemic origin because it is composed of similar complex carbonaceous compounds. And life also being so functionally very complicated, in addition that it can all the time renew itself, produce more and more of the same compounds, it also has the catabolic pathways where it can break down the composition of the biogenic molecules. Okay, so life being very complex, we can in a way compare it, for instance, to airplanes, even jumbo jets. Probably same order of complexity within a small living organism and in a jumbo jet airplane. And of course, this kind of a complexity cannot come out of nothing, but it has evolved gradually. And just by logic, it is clear that it has started from some very simple form, something that can somehow behave in a lifelike manner, that has some qualities of life. For instance, here we have the paper glider, which can behave in the same way as the airplane, but we all realize that it is very different in composition, very simple in its function, but it can do the one basic thing, which is that it can fly. And likewise, for the beginning of life, there were some kind of molecular complexes which could do the one basic thing, which is to replicate. So to move from the prebiotic chemistry towards life, we first had to have the critical components that were needed to make up something that could do the basic thing. And when we are going towards life, the basic thing, the most essential thing, was the replication. So we had to have some kind of assembly of components that could replicate. And then when replication starts, then the natural selection steps in. And always something that can replicate and can maintain itself, that will be preserved. So that is the beginning of evolution, and maybe that we can consider as the beginning of life. So life is some kind of a chemical system that can replicate, maintain itself, and evolve. Evolution is the important thing. Okay, but so again, looking at this transition from the prebiotic chemistry, we were just hearing from Rafael of the prebiotic synthesis of different compounds like nucleobases, for instance. So we know that somehow these building blocks or the components of life were prebiotically formed, and eventually, or in some suitable conditions, just the correct building blocks were produced. So nucleotides appeared, amino acids appeared, and lipids. Nucleotides are needed for making of the genetic material, amino acids are needed for making proteins, and lipids are needed for making membranes. And now, as we just heard, so we know that some groups of chemists are just in these days and in these years solving or resolving the question of how these can be formed in prebiotic conditions. Okay, but the building blocks are certainly not the same as life. They are not enough to be called living. But somehow they need to be assembled into more and more complex polymers, long structures. So the nucleotides would make RNA and then later DNA, and amino acids make proteins. And this assembly of polymers is very difficult step, and this we don't really understand yet how it has worked. Okay, and here I show you some of these complex molecules. So here on the right-hand side, here is a schematic structure of DNA. So DNA is composed of two strands of nucleotides being connected to one another. So this makes the famous double helix of DNA. And the two strands are running head to tail, so in anti-parallel orientations. And on the left, we see a single strand, which is the picture of RNA strand. And you can see that both RNA and DNA are composed of very similar building blocks, or the nucleotides. And the nucleotides are running in a very regular chain connected one to another with very exact chemical bonds, being connected always from the certain carbon of previous nucleotide through a phosphate bond or bridge to the next nucleotide. And as you see, the structures of these building blocks have to be exactly correct, and they have to be correctly connected to one another. So the accuracy of this chemistry is very amazing and very demanding for prebiotic conditions. Now, I can tell you that within our cells, our metabolic pathways can synthesize these compounds very effectively and very accurately. But such synthesis is very difficult in non-living environment without enzymatic catalysis. Okay, but so somehow in some kind of a very specific conditions, adequately long chains of this kind of a nucleotides have somehow assembled so that then it became functional somehow. Okay, so RNA and DNA being very central components of the living system, and they are composed of the nucleotides, and the genetic information here in these strands is coded into the sequence of the nucleotide bases. In DNA, they are adenine, thymine, guanidine, and cytosine, and in RNA, very similar bases, except that instead of thymidine, there is uracil used. But very similar groups of complexes. Okay, so that was DNA and RNA, and then we need the amino acids. The nature of the life is using 20 different amino acids. They are shown in these pictures, and differing from RNA and DNA, which are quite difficult to synthesize, and the nucleotides are very difficult to synthesize in prebiotic conditions. Differing from that, it seems that the amino acids are fairly easily synthesized in suitable energetic conditions. So apparently, amino acids would have been quite readily available for the emergence of life. But then, now I still mention that these circles here mean that amino acids are different. They can be either positively or negatively charged, or then they can be neutral. And these electric properties very essentially affect how these amino acids behave in the compounds or in the proteins. Because then to make proteins, amino acids are connected one to another into very long chains. And this combining of the amino acids, this is again very difficult process. Now, when the amino acids are first linked to one another, they form the chain, which is called polypeptide. So that would be the primary structure of the amino acid chain. And then the chain is folded up on itself into different specific structures and into more complex structures. And now it is the properties of the amino acids that determine this folding structure. And last time, Ferrari from Poland was telling of the importance of the folding of the protein structure, which finally makes the functional protein. Okay, so life needs that kind of structures to start to work. And now we can start to ask that how was it in the beginning, that what was first being formed, what kind of structures were being formed, also where could they form, and why and how. There's a lot of open questions related to this process. And then what kind of a structure was first appearing in such form that it was able to replicate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the very crucial step that was kind of the initial step in life, is that some structure was able to replicate. And then, if it started to replicate, can we already consider it as a living organism? We were saying earlier that life is very complex. And the question is that what can we call life? How complex it needs to become in order that we can consider it living? And we can also wonder, why did life become just the kind what it is now? Like we have this one kind of life, so why did it become just like this? And whether it would have been possible that some other kind of life would have emerged. And we certainly don't have very accurate answers to those questions. And now it is actually better, like we cannot go back and explore how the process actually happened. But about the only option is that we look at life how it is now and try to find the essential features of life and try to go back and see how these features evolved and where they came from. Okay? So, the essential features of life as we know it now, this one life that we have here. So one feature is the cellularity. We only consider cellular organisms as living. All life is cellular. And another feature is the molecular machinery that is located inside the cells. And the essential parts there are the genome, encoded in the DNA sequence. It contains all the genes that regulate the functions. And then the next part of the machinery are the RNA transcripts, which are copied from the DNA. So it is very similar to DNA, and it carries the genetic information. And the RNA takes the information into the translation machinery. And this, again, is quite complex machinery. We will look in more detail shortly. And the translation machinery produces proteins based on the genetic information that it reads from the RNA transcript. So this is kind of like a machine that converts the instructions into the product. Okay, so first about the cellularity of life. And this means materializes in the way that all life is confined within cell membranes. So all life is cellular. Life can be quite simple. So in these two pictures, we see the most simple forms of the present day life, which are bacteria and archaea. And these both are prokaryotic organisms, meaning that they don't have nuclei, and they don't have hardly any other intracellular structures or membranes. They are just simple cell membrane that closes within the cell cytoplasm, And then within the cytoplasm there exists the genome, kind of as an open DNA circle. And then within a cell division, the cytoplasm and the genome is first replicated and then divided equally to 2 cells. So this happens in this kind of simple way in bacteria, and in a very similar way also in the archaea. And now, do take note that the kind of the division machinery is an essential, important part of the cellularity, because we need the division machinery to maintain the cell lineages. Okay. Now, and while the bacteria and the archaea are the most simple life forms that we have here on Earth at present time, then the picture here on the lower part is showing the other extreme, which is the eukaryotic cell, which in itself is very complex, and it has a lot of internal structures like the nucleus and mitochondria and different membrane structures, and so it has much higher complexity. But even so, the basic chemical composition of all these 3 domains of life is very similar. Okay. And then we can ask here that if we look at this quite high chemical complexity, so we can ask if all this was necessary, or what parts of it was necessary for the first living organisms that we can already call living. So what do we need for life? Okay, so that was the cell structure, and then here we have the molecular machinery structure. So we have already said that it includes the genetic information that is encoded in the nucleotide sequence of DNA, that is shown here in the blue spirals, like DNA double helix structure. And the sequences are copied from there into RNA sequences, and the RNA sequences transport the information into the translation machinery, which is composed of ribosomes and of transfer RNA structures. The transfer RNA structures transport the amino acids into the process, and then the ribosome assembles the amino acids into polypeptides, which then falls into proteins. Okay, so there are many components to this, and also the components themselves are quite complicated. Okay, and then again we can ask of what of this was necessary for the life in the beginning. And if we say that the molecular machinery is necessary, and at least some kind of a protein synthesis is required to maintain, or at least some kind of catalytic function or replication is required for maintaining life, then we are kind of in a circular situation in life today. Is that we have the genetic information which is copied into RNA, and then information is used to make proteins, and then proteins are needed to replicate the information. So we have a very circular situation that information is needed to make proteins, and proteins are needed to maintain the information. So in this situation, we kind of are left with the question that what came first? Was it the information or the proteins? It's the classical chicken or egg question. They need each other. It's a closed circle. But now the solution for this question comes from the RNA, because the RNA is kind of the intermediating molecule. RNA carries the information, but RNA can also in a very simple system, it can function in a similar way as the proteins. So apparently, in the very beginning, it has been the RNA molecules that have been doing both functions, carrying the information and also doing the catalytic functions. So it seems like the circle has started from the RNA. And this is the principle where the RNA world hypothesis comes from. Okay. So the machinery is quite important for life, and it is very similar in all life forms. And this fact, the kind of the similarity of the central molecular machinery in all life forms, that tells us that all life has descended from the same origin. We all have the same ancestor that already had this molecular machinery. And this common ancestor is nowadays called the last universal common ancestor, or by nickname called LUCA. And now it apparently has been some real existing evolutionary states of life preceding the division of the three domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. So it has existed. And so it is the last common ancestor, but it's not the first common ancestor. So there has been some kind of a evolution of life even before LUCA. And then we can ask what was there before LUCA and where did LUCA come from? Okay, and some kind of information we get from this molecular machinery, as I told you already. So this molecular machinery is composed of transfer RNAs, depicted as tRNA, that means transfer RNAs, and then ribosomes. And the tRNAs are not very complicated. They are about 70 nucleotides long, but there are several different one for each amino acid. But then the ribosome is very complex nowadays, at least. It contains dozens of different proteins, and it contains also several different RNAs. But now the kind of the essential thing here is that when the ribosome is working to make the polypeptide, meaning that it's connecting amino acids one to another, so it is the RNA molecules inside the structure that are actually doing the work. So it seems that the RNAs inside of the ribosome are maybe the first ones that have started the function. Okay. So RNAs, say the RNAs inside of the ribosome probably are very, very ancient and have been some of the very first replicating molecules, and then have been gone through very complex process and evolution to become ribosomal RNAs. And the RNAs were replicating somehow, and it is very difficult process. And then it led to the gradual assembly of the translation machinery, which is composed of very many different parts. And they are very big questions for chemists, and we don't know exactly how the system evolved. But maybe someday some very smart chemists will get some more answers for these questions. Okay, so in principle now I say again that it seems that the molecular machinery, meaning the RNA, messenger RNA and the translation machinery are probably the first components of living system. And then somehow this molecular machinery had to be contained or taken into a membrane envelope to make the cell. You know, like today we say that all life has to be cellular. So it's not like before, it is within a membrane, cell membrane. And now then, the next question comes that how was this replication machinery or the early ribosomes, how were they encapsulated into the membrane envelope? And now, again, we don't know exactly, but for these questions, there is actually at least two quite different schools, different lines of thought. And they both are quite strong. And one school is saying that the encapsulation was taking place by the process of first spontaneous assembly of different lipid molecules into just vesicle structures. You know that if you have different lipids suspended in water, these lipids can quite easily aggregate to one another, and they can make, for instance, membrane on the surface, or they can make little vesicles inside the water. You know, like for instance, if you have oil in water bottle and you shake it, so it turns spontaneously into vesicles or spheres. And because different lipids can spontaneously make vesicles, then it is possible that this kind of just simple spontaneously forming vesicles have initially enclosed different RNA molecules. For instance, by different physical forces, the vesicles can break and make membranes and then reform. And in this kind of breaking and making process, they can take in different molecules. And the theory goes that just accidentally and randomly some RNA molecules have been enclosed into vesicles. And then these kind of vesicles would have developed into real protocells and then eventually to functional cells. But one main problem here is that, of course, you need a lot of import and export of the building blocks if you are making like a more and more complex system. So the traffic of the building blocks through the membranes is kind of hampered, I think. So I am a little bit skeptical of this model. So one problem is the transport of the molecules, and another problem is that these kind of vesicles don't have any kind of division machinery, meaning that the propagation of these protocells would happen only by just random breaking and random remaking, reformation, meaning that there is no continuity. If you break the cell, you lose all the contents, and you have to start anew from scratch. So at least for this reason, I personally am a little bit skeptical with this model. But again, there are very prominent scientists who are working with this system and think that this is the way how life started, and that may be, but I'm not sure. Because personally, I must say that I would like to go with this other school, presented, for instance, by Eugen Kunin and others, who are suggesting that life was probably starting in, for instance, in black smoker kind of structures in the sea bottom, where there was very rich chemical environment, a lot of metals and different compounds being dissolved into the hot water that was produced by the hydrothermal system. And this chemically very rich water is kind of running out from the hydrothermal vents and going through different metallic structures, and particularly with the black smokers, there are these metallic precipitates that form some kind of a tower-like structures on these outlets. And for instance, this kind of inorganic systems could have made compartments that could have been good hatcheries for like the prebiotic chemistry, because there's a lot of hydrogen and a lot of reduced compounds being produced in these very energetic environments. And so these kind of inorganic compartments could have enclosed the prebiotic chemistry so that different molecules could have been forming, and there could have been a kind of large and versatile molecular community where different molecules could have been very intensively interacting and recombining, meaning that they would have been making a lot of chemical repertoire and different versions of the molecules. And this process in itself would have been building up the complexity and also providing a lot of different interacting molecules that could make a functional molecular community which would actually resemble a living cell. Although in this case it would have been inside this kind of metallic or inorganic surface or structure. And this theory also includes that this kind of a hatchery, molecular hatchery, would have produced different types of organisms. For instance, first it would have produced the RNA world, and from this would eventually emerge the RNA protein world. Invention of the protein translation system would have produced the proteins. And now these could even coexist so that the RNA world is constantly producing the RNA protein world. And at some point in time or a space, the RNA protein world would produce or convert also into DNA sequences. And then the DNA-based genetic system being stronger would gradually take over or start to dominate, at least in one or some sections of this hatchery. And then it would produce organisms that would be adequately complicated so that they could be enclosed into membranes and kind of escape to the outside world. Because you need to be quite complex system that you can survive in the outside world. But so this kind of complex environment could have produced the cells that can survive. But it would have also produced more simple things. Because, for instance, the RNA protein world, we can imagine that it resembles very much RNA viruses. It is quite possible that our present-day RNA viruses might be something similar to the life forms that have appeared in the RNA protein system. And likewise, the RNA DNA protein system might be very similar to retroviruses. And the DNA world could have produced the cells, and also it could have produced DNA viruses. So this theory includes that the viruses would have originated and appeared in the same site where the cellular life was developing. Okay, and then if we still go back here, then we can ask of why would these kind of replicating molecules ever get a membrane around themselves? How would they ever form real membrane enclosed cells? And one theory here is that in that kind of hatchery, there probably has been a very hard competition between different replicating molecules, and there also has been parasitic molecules. For instance, the progenitors of the viruses and also different selfish replicators, meaning replicating molecules that are very kind of effective but non-functional and that could easily kind of take over and contaminate and even kind of destroy the whole molecular community. And so it is possible that there has been a need for the real kind of positive replicators to protect themselves by enclosing into some kind of a private replication niche. And we know that today, still in our living world, we have a lot of viruses. Just about all our cellular species are contaminated or parasitized by viruses, different viruses. And a lot of these viruses, when they replicate inside of host cells, they tend to make this kind of a membranous pouches or small pockets into the membranes where they can replicate in a protected fashion. And this is one kind of a theory that this kind of a vesicles might have served even in the early stages as a kind of replication sites for the RNA genomes. Here is still a micrograph picture showing just contemporary cells. The viruses are inducing some kind of replication vesicles into the membranes. And different viruses are making different kinds of vesicles, but quite many viruses do make some kind of replication vesicles. And now I still would like to emphasize a little bit more about the role of viruses in the evolution of life. So it has been often mentioned that viruses can be used maybe as models of the early stages of life, because quite clearly viruses originate in the same origin of life. They are composed of the same kind of building blocks and they come from the same origin of life. But they still are different kind of organisms. They are not cellular life, and we don't consider them living, but we consider them as parasites of cellular life. And they are still present within our biosphere. All the cellular species, most likely all cellular species, have their own viral parasites and many different kinds of viral parasites. So there is actually many more of viral species than there are cellular species. And viruses live inside of cellular hosts, and although we do not consider them living, but they can replicate, and they are actually the most simple replicating systems. So they can reproduce, but they are not cellular. So we have a question here of whether we should consider viruses to be alive or not. Anyway, they have been along with the cellular life throughout the ages. As long as there has been cells, there has been viruses. And viruses have been as parasites, but they also have integrated into the genomes so that maybe all cellular species contain some viral elements inside the genomes. Bacteria contain maybe 10%, and for instance, we humans have about half of our genome coming from different viruses. So viruses are very well integrated into the life, and they have been very important to drive the evolution. There is a lot of viral infections taking place in the cellular life all the time. This many viral infections per second going on all the time in different hosts, mostly in bacteria, but in all species. And they have been having a very strong effect on the evolution of the cellular life. So we can see that viruses originate from the same beginning of life, and they have been going along and evolving with the cellular life forms throughout the ages, and all the three domains of life, meaning bacteria, eukaryotes, and archaea have their own viruses. And now if we think that the viruses resemble probably the very simplest, earliest replicating systems, and that they have also been maintained with the biosphere throughout the ages, we can again now wonder who is the chicken and who is the egg. How much have viruses been involved in producing cellular life, or is it the cellular life that has been producing viruses? At least they are very tightly interconnected. The cells maintain viruses, but the viruses very much affect the evolution of cells. Okay, here I have the same picture what Rafael was showing earlier, kind of the time scale of our planet and the appearance of life. So life appeared here through some kind of prebiotic chemistry very early after the formation of the planet. So the planet was formed by 4.5 billion years ago, and then it cooled down and some kind of prebiotic era took place. And then already at the time of 3.8 billion years back, we had the oldest preserved signs of life, meaning that life had to take place sometime earlier, because the biosignatures we can find already from this time. And the evolution or the appearance or the emergence of life was a gradual process. There was some kind of a quite lengthy prebiotic and then biotic evolution. And it led to last universal common ancestor before the division of the three domains. And the last common ancestor probably was RNA-based life or an early DNA-based life. Right, and here are the oldest evidence of life, and this dates back to the 3.8 billion years. The numbers would be there behind my head, and these are preserved in the Isua rocks in Western Greenland. Okay, and the big question is that what was there before this? And we don't know exactly, but it is one of the biggest questions in science. But at least we know that this came out of it. And once the replication started and the natural selection started to promote most fit organisms, from there on it has been just by Darwinian evolution that life has evolved. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have one question. My question is that you mentioned that in the early stages, especially the pre-RNA or RNA stages, it has to have a kind of a interface function. Recently, there appeared a study that says that life before RNA must have been building on AEG molecules. Can you tell us something about it?
Now I'm afraid I don't quite recognize what you are mentioning. You probably mean different types of nucleotide
Yes.
analogs.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So it has been proposed multiple times, and because of the prebiotic synthesis of nucleotides is so extremely difficult. So and also there are the problems with chirality of nucleotides. It has been proposed that some kind of a more simple molecules would have been used prior to the present form of nucleotides, for instance, DNA molecules that would have been based on amino acids or different 4 carbon-based sugars being as the central molecules of the nucleotides. And these have been proposed, but although it is feasible, there is no evidence for such life forms ever being present. And I think that if there would have been such a evolutionary stage early in the life, meaning kind of a very common ancestor for all life forms, that it would have left some kind of chemical trace
Yes. Yes.
in the lineage. But because we don't see any that kind of compounds being used or synthesized into life or in the living cells, I think that they have not ever been used.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mate and Kirsi, for that answer. I now turn to University of Szczecin. Franco, do you or your students have any questions for Kirsi?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Kirsi, for the nice and, for me, enlightening lecture. I have one first question by Adam Watsne, which is coming.
Hello, thanks for the lecture. And my question is, RNA seems to be more flexible than DNA it can encode and transcript information. Why, in this situation, DNA systems evolved? This is the first question. And the other is, what profit do we have that our DNA is in the nucleus of a cell?
Right. Okay. The first answer to the first question is that DNA is by far a supreme information carrier compared to RNA, because RNA is extremely fragile. It becomes hydrolyzed and breaks easily even in water solution. And apparently, say in water environment, it probably would not be adequately stable to code for any adequately large information. Maybe the first RNAs could rather have formed in formamide solution, which would make them more stable. But at least in such aqueous solution, RNA is very unstable. So we would have very short-lived and very, very fragile genomes in RNA. So DNA was much more stable, and genomes became stable. And you asked, the other question was
about what is profit of this, that DNA is hidden in nucleus of the cell. You presented some microscopic organisms which don't have cells, not cells but nucleus.
Yes, right. Okay. So you are, in a way, you are asking about the origin of the eukaryotic lineage, and that is one of the big questions. What we don't know exactly on how it arose. Quite clearly, it has incorporated elements from bacteria and archaea. So genes have been transferred to the eukaryotic genome, both from bacteria and from archaea. And for instance, the mitochondria inside of eukaryotic cell, it is clearly originally has been a bacteria that has been just kind of taken into a new host cell and became an intracellular symbiont, as is also the chloroplasts in plant cells. But origin of the nucleus is rather an open question, and there are theories that that it may originate from invasion of a virus into, for instance, into an archaean prokaryotic cell, which would mean that our whole eukaryotic nucleus would originate from a virus. But this is certainly not proven, but I think the nuclear genome, meaning the eukaryotic genome, has a lot of properties that are similar to viruses. So we really may be a viral descendant.
Thanks. Okay, so I have also a question. I don't know if others have a question. So my question is in some way weak motivation against this interesting hypothesis that viruses can be some remaining, some remnant of elder organisms, because apparently they cannot replicate without a cell. So according to me, and I know it is your argumentation is quite convincing, but because you said that 45% of our genes is of virus origin, but in some sense it looks from this other argumentation that they are the effect of evolution. They are parasites that evolved at a later stage when the cells were already present and RNA and DNA were already formed. And so can you comment about that?
Yes, many people are puzzled about that particular question, and many do say that viruses must be kind of younger than cells, because viruses are dependent on cellular hosts. Okay, and that sounds like a quite valid argument, but then if we are thinking that there has been an era before the emergence of cells, and now this kind of comes back to the question of how did the cellular assembly of life emerge, and whether there was some kind of a molecular communities before the cells actually were formed, or whether the molecular evolution took place from the beginning within cell membrane. And now this relates quite well to the origin of viruses, that if there has been this kind of a molecular evolution going on before the appearance of membrane enclosed cells, meaning within, for instance, in organic compartments, then quite clearly the viruses could originate from there. And also there is quite clear phylogeny from viruses, showing that there are these distinct viral genes or protein domains that are very conserved in viruses and that occur nowadays still in all different domains of life, of the cellular life. So archaeal viruses and bacterial viruses and eukaryotic viruses all have these same viral protein domains. They are called the hallmark proteins of viruses, meaning that the viruses are older than LUCA. Viruses are older than the 3 domains of life. So they really, I think it's quite convincing that viruses come from the same origin of life.
Okay, thank you very much for the exhausting answers, for the very, very nice lecture. And I had, of course, plenty of questions, but let's give to the other sides the chance to put questions. And I thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers of today. Bye. See you next time.
Thank you, Franco. Hello to Eva.
Yes, thank you. She's greeting you too. Just she couldn't come here because she's very, very busy and very sorry.
Yes. Okay. Greetings.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Franco. We are now going to go to Raffaele just to see if Professor Saladino has any questions.
Yes, thank you, Kirsti, for the presentation. I have a general question. What is your opinion about the role of other chemical elements like silicio or arsenicum in a possible alternative to biomolecules as we know them?
I did not quite hear your question, but I think you are asking of a possible role of silicon or what elements?
Yes, I ask about your opinion on the possibility that other chemical elements like silicio or arsenicum can be used for the synthesis of biomolecules functional like that existing on the Earth.
Okay, so the biomolecules are very much based on the chemical properties of carbon and on the tendency of carbon to make the 4 covalent bonds, and its very high affinity to become reduced with hydrogen, for instance, and kind of the chemical flexibility of carbon backbones with either single or double or triple bonds, and the kind of the high tendency of hydrocarbons to make very long or complex structures, which basically silicon could also form similar structures with 4 covalent bonds, but silicon becomes way too easily oxidized, and certainly it does not have such high tendency to form as complex, as long, as complicated structures as carbon. So I think carbon is by far the most suitable element for making complex molecules. And arsenic instead of phosphorus. So phosphorus being kind of the very suitable linker molecule for our nucleotides in our nucleotide chains. So arsenic basically could replace it, being a similar element by its atomic structure, but the ester bonds of arsenic are much bigger than those of phosphorus, so we would not be able to build as strong strands or chains or molecules as we can build with phosphodiester bonds. So it seems like the selection of elements is absolutely the most optimal as we have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the lecture again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.